Welcome back to Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small, co-host Paul Ogden. Our guests are Matt Stone, Gary Welsh. I won't reintroduce everybody because I was just told not to repeat myself like that again. Thanks, Matt. This unfortunately will be Matt's last appearance on this show. He has to not come back
now. When the next guest bails on you, you'll come running back.
We've been talking about residency requirements for voting and holding office, etc., especially in light of the controversy here in Indianapolis and Indiana about Senator Richard Lugar, who has been a United States Senator longer than like 96% of the players in the National Football League have been alive. Longer than like 97% of the players in the Major League Baseball leagues have been alive.
Murdoch's new commercial actually has disco playing in the background. I thought that was a really good concept.
That's because Murdoch likes
also,
that. Also,
disco is really awesome.
But here's the thing. We were talking just a moment ago about how Richard Lugar is required to return back to his duty station in terms of maintaining some... And I just wanted to point out, that goes back to the old magic, because Harry Potter, as long as he returned to his family home once a year, he was protected by his mother's magic when she gave her life and protected him from who, we can't say the name. But so the same principle applies here, except I guess Richard Lugar is immune from that kind of evil.
It's a very important point to bring up, because essentially the position of Lugar and the Attorney General opinions that have come down on his side is that fail-safe provision of the Constitution means that his residence was permanently frozen in place 35 years ago when he abandoned it, and would remain his residence so long as he was a U.S. Senator. And
just as a point, we did invite people from the Lugar campaign to appear on this show today.
Right. Now, obviously the Marion County Election Board disagreed with the interpretation given to the constitutional provision that was incorporated into the Indiana Election Code down to the precinct level, that the Lugars were relying upon to continue registering at a home that had been purchased by two subsequent owners, and the current owner had no idea that they were even using it for purposes of registering to vote and get an Indiana driver's license and pay their income taxes and so on.
But were they actually related?
They are not related.
How do you know? Did you ask?
They are not related.
She has been asked.
They did not. She did not.
Oh, okay.
The current owner didn't even know that. Was shocked to learn when she was asked about them being registered to vote at that address, and she has signed a declaration under penalties of perjury that she has no agreement with them, that she's never consented to them using her home as their residence for voting registration purposes. But what we learned after the hearing was that there is an obscure Senate rule. And I don't know how it could be considered an obscure Senate rule, since it dealt with something as basic as how does a senator know what he can bill for his travel expenses back to his home state. And apparently, according to this obscure Senate rule, a senator is required to designate a duty station within his home state, which is his place of residence that he returns to in his home state when the Senate is not in session. And when the Senate is not in session and they go home to their duty station, they are not allowed under Senate rules to bill the taxpayers for their travel. And Senator Lugar admitted just the other day that due to a staff error and not being familiar with this obscure Senate rule, they had been billing taxpayers for overnight accommodations at hotels when he was back in Indiana while the Senate was not in session.
Yeah, but let's
they were repaying that. So even the Senate rules contemplate, for purposes of reimbursing senators for their travel, that they are maintaining a duty station or a residence within their state so they can determine what can be billed when they're not in session versus when they're in session.
But Lugar did identify a duty station, did he not?
And he did, and he was identifying 3200 Highwoods Court, the home he abandoned 35 years ago, that is owned and occupied by Elizabeth Hughes, who has no agreement with Senator Lugar and his wife to allow them to use it. She receives no compensation for him doing that, but yet he was allowed the benefit of using that as his duty station.
But 2 points to clarify. One, how do we know that hotel wasn't down in Decatur Township? And two, if it was a motel, I mean, I'm sure, and secondly, I'm sure it was a very, very pedestrian, blue-collar, heart of America kind of hotel, like a Motel 6 in Decatur Township, right?
I think the last time he came to town was a JW Marriott.
I believe he's been staying at the Marriott downtown.
The JW Marriott?
No, the Marriott
downtown,
which is a different one. But previously, he had been staying at the one of the airports at the hotel.
Ah, and that could be out in Decatur Township.
That could be, yes.
See? So he's going back to his roots. Well, it's Indiana, so it's roots.
Yeah.
So, well, it is.
Correct.
But Indiana can have a different provision for habitation or residency than that's as long as our provisions are more permissive than the feds, they presumably would be.
Well, what if you read the Attorney General opinions, they opine that once a U.S. Senator or a U.S. Congressman from Indiana is elected, their residence is frozen frozen at that address, and they can abandon that residence altogether. And as long as they're continuing to serve in Congress and being reelected, they don't have to have an actual physical presence in the state. And my argument is that the framers of the Indiana Constitution could not have intended that fail-safe provision would be applied that way, because number one, they knew that the U.S. Constitution required members of Congress to be inhabitants of their states, and number two, they were part-time lawmakers who presumably they couldn't rely on their jobs. Their full-time jobs were in their home state, so they had to return home and have a place to live to support themselves and their families.
You raised a point a couple of minutes ago about soldiers serving in wars not being able to come home. Actually, during the Civil War, William Tecumseh Sherman released Indiana troops to come home to vote in the 1864 presidential elections. Allowed them to come home because they needed the votes back here.
Well, but at that point in their absentee voting provisions for absentee voting did not exist at that time. So unless you could show up in person to vote on election day, you didn't get to cast a vote. So even if you were absent from the state, you were going to have to return home on the day of the election if you wanted to cast a vote back then, because they had no provision for absentee voting. And there's actually an Indiana Supreme Court case where our state Supreme Court opined, I don't think that it's probably, it would agree with this opinion today, but where the Indiana Supreme Court actually said in dictum that there was no constitutional requirement for absentee balloting.
Now, can I ask one other thing? With these Attorney General opinions, they're written in the case of Lugar, but Gary, you know Indiana history pretty well. Paul, you've lived here a long time. Has any other member of Congress from Indiana ever done something like this compared to Lugar? Because I know Todd Rokita lives in his district. I know Andre and Julia Carson maintained at least some type of residence in their district. I'm pretty sure Andy Jacobs did. Dr. Bichon down in the 8th district. So has anybody else done something like even Evan Bai rented a dumpy apartment on the south side of town?
Well, I said a dumpy apartment.
He and Susan did not live in that apartment. But at least he rented something. So has anybody else throughout these?
I'm not aware of anyone who contemporaneously, while serving in Congress, had announced that they were doing this and relying on this provision. Now, I can tell you that in one of his news reports, Wish TV's Jim Shella, who obviously has been very favorable to Lugar's position, stated that he did a story on U.S. Representative Lee Hamilton, who of course served for several decades representing a congressional district in southeastern Indiana, and he learned that he wanted to go down and talk to his neighbors about a particular issue, and when he went to the home where Representative Hamilton was registered in Columbus, Indiana, he learned that it was actually occupied by an executive with Cummins engine. But he said, well, he doesn't actually, this is my home, but he has my permission to use this for his voter registration. And Shella was trying to analogize the two, but the difference being, obviously, that executive at Cummins knew that he was relying upon that for his voter registration and vouched for him. Elizabeth Hughes will not vouch for the Lugars being able to use their voter registration. I would also point out that I know that in researching this, we learned that Evan Bai at one time, for example, he and Susan were registered to vote at the home of Fred Glass while he was serving in the Senate.
Wow.
Later, they actually purchased a condo on the north side that they used as their residence, and they claim a homestead exemption.
They still do
on that condominium, and they are still relying on that, even though they primarily reside in Washington.
Kids go to school there.
That's correct.
And see, what I was interested in knowing is if when Mr. Shella went to the residence there in Columbus, if Elizabeth Hughes was occupying that house, then I would have said we had a lot of dots connected here.
A couple things on the Attorney General opinion. I think they get misrepresented in the media. And correct me, Gary, if I'm wrong. And I'll hit this on the next segment.
Yeah, we'll be back in just a minute.